When people look at Mel Brooks, they don't just see a man nearing the end of his life. They see a century of American memory standing upright. A survivor of eras that rose and vanished. A man who made the country laugh through wars, scandals, and cultural collapse. Laughter was never just his profession. It was his shield, his way of confronting darkness without surrendering to it. And yet in recent days, that shield has been gone. At 98 years old, Mel Brooks has buried almost everyone who once shared his table. His wife, his closest friends, his creative brothers. For years, his life had narrowed into something quiet and familiar. Evenings spent at home, simple routines, old habits that anchored him to a world that was steadily disappearing. Among those habits was a bond that went back decades, rooted not in Hollywood, but in family. A bond with the Reiners that blurred the line between friendship and blood. When news began to spread about Rob Reiner, the world reacted the way it always does. Headlines moved faster than understanding. Details were stripped down to timelines and allegations. The story was framed as a sudden collapse, a shocking break from everything that came before. But Mel Brooks did not respond. He did not release a statement. He did not offer condolences or context. In a city that feeds on instant reaction, his silence stood out. Those who knew him understood why. Mel was not reacting as an observer. He was reacting as someone who had watched this family evolve over decades. Someone who had been present for the private moments no camera ever captured. He had seen Rob not as a public figure, but as a son, a husband, a father. And he had seen the slow accumulation of strain that never made its way into interviews or award speeches. When Mel finally agreed to speak, it was not to correct the record or defend a legacy. It was not to comment on an investigation or speculate about guilt. He spoke because silence had begun to feel like complicity. What he offered was not a breaking news revelation, but a chronology of human decisions. A story that did not begin with violence, but with love, with loyalty, with promises made in good faith and kept long after they should have been questioned. This was not a crime story, at least not in the way the public had been told. It was something slower and far more unsettling. A story about how devotion can cloud judgment, how fear disguises itself as compassion, and how the people closest to a tragedy often see it forming long before the world ever looks in their direction. The public version of the story arrived already packaged. Clean language, official timelines, a sequence of events arranged to feel sudden and contained as if everything had erupted in a single unforeseeable moment. It was easier that way, easier to believe in a rupture than in a slow collapse, easier to accept shock than to confront the idea that warning signs can exist for years without changing the outcome. From Mel's perspective, nothing about this felt abrupt. What the headlines called a breaking story felt to him like the final chapter of something he had been watching unfold in fragments. Not through rumors or speculation, but through conversations held in confidence, through pauses that lingered too long, through a tone of voice that shifted from concern to vigilance. He did not claim to know how things would end, only that the tension had been building long before anyone outside the family noticed it. Mel described a household shaped by effort. Effort to keep things normal. Effort to believe progress was still possible. Effort to hold on to a version of the future that felt safer than the alternatives. From the outside, there was stability. From the inside, there was constant adjustment. Schedules changed. Expectations softened. Boundaries were revised and revised again, always with the same reasoning. This is temporary. This is necessary. This is what love requires right now. What troubled Mel was not any single decision, but the pattern they formed when placed side by side. Each choice on its own could be defended. Each compromise felt humane. But together they created an environment where tension became routine and concern was normalized. Over time, what once would have triggered alarm was absorbed into daily life. And once danger becomes familiar, it becomes harder to name. This was the part of the story Mel felt had been erased. Not the violence, but the years of adaptation that came before it. The slow recalibration of what felt acceptable. The quiet agreements people make with themselves in order to avoid confronting the possibility that love, no matter how sincere, may not be enough to hold everything together. Over time, the adjustments became more noticeable. Not dramatic enough to demand intervention, but significant enough to change how the house functioned. Mel spoke about small details that carried weight precisely because they were never meant to be permanent. A door that used to stay open now closed at night. Conversations that once flowed easily now stopped when someone entered the room. Sleep that came lighter, interrupted by listening rather than resting. These were not signs anyone wanted to name out loud, because naming them would force a decision no one felt ready to make. Mel remembered asking careful questions, not confrontational ones, questions shaped by worry rather than judgment. What happens if this continues? What happens if it gets worse? Each time, the answers return to the same place. Hope. Promises. The belief that pushing too hard could shatter whatever fragile balance still existed. In a family built on communication and empathy, the idea of drawing an unyielding line felt cruel. And so the line kept moving inch by inch, always in the direction of accommodation. What made this especially difficult was the absence of a clear breaking point. There was no single incident that forced clarity. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of unease, a sense that everyone was adjusting their lives around an unpredictable center, while convincing themselves that vigilance was the same as control. Mel sensed the danger in that thinking. Watching closely does not always mean intervening. And sometimes awareness without action becomes its own form of paralysis. Looking back, Mel does not describe these moments with certainty. He describes them with discomfort, with the knowledge that concern was present, but urgency never fully took hold. By the time fear became impossible to dismiss, it had already been woven into the fabric of everyday life. And once that happens, separating love from risk becomes far more complicated than anyone expects. The night that changed everything did not announce itself as extraordinary. It arrived the way tension often does in families under strain, quietly, with familiar patterns, repeating themselves, but carrying an edge that felt sharper than before. Voices rose, then fell. Accusations circled the same unresolved fears. What unsettled Mel most, when he later reflected on it, was not that conflict existed, but that it had become expected, as if everyone involved had learned to brace rather than resolve. Late that evening, Mel's phone rang. He was already in bed, half asleep, and for a moment he considered letting it go. When he answered, Rob's voice was controlled but brittle, not panicked, not theatrical, just tight as though he were holding something back. He spoke about escalating arguments about suspicion and fixation, about a sense that the house no longer felt stable. Mel listened, recognizing a tone he had heard before, when fear finally slips past reassurance. Mel urged him to leave, to step outside, to put distance between himself and a situation that felt increasingly volatile. It was practical advice offered without drama. Rob did not argue the logic. What stopped him was something else. He said he could not leave his wife alone in that moment. He believed that if he removed himself, the pressure would fall entirely on her, Staying felt dangerous, but leaving felt like abandonment. That decision, Mel understood, was not made in confusion. It was made in character. The same sense of responsibility that had guided years of compromise now narrowed into a single choice. Rob stayed, and in doing so, he accepted a risk he had been quietly carrying for a long time. For Mel, that call would never fade into abstraction. It would always be the moment when concern became final, and when love, obligation, and fear converged into a silence that no explanation could undo. In the aftermath, as the shock spread outward, Mel found himself resisting the simplest explanations. He did not believe this could be understood as a single act, isolated from everything that came before it. What mattered to him was the pressure that had been building quietly for years. Pressure shaped by expectation, by legacy, by growing up beneath names that carried enormous weight long before any personal identity had fully formed. Mel spoke about how success, when inherited rather than earned, can feel like a sentence instead of a gift. The shadow of achievement does not always inspire. Sometimes it suffocates. When recognition does not arrive on schedule, frustration looks for someone to blame. And in families where love and opportunity are abundant, resentment can twist itself into a belief that something has been taken rather than something that must be built. At the same time, Mel grew openly angry about the environment that surrounded the family. Not individuals, but a culture of reassurance. Advisors, professionals, and well-meaning voices who softened hard truths with careful language, who replaced urgency with patience, who framed danger as something abstract, manageable, theoretical. In that atmosphere, decisive action always felt premature. Responsibility dissolved into shared understanding, and shared understanding became a reason to wait. From the outside, everything still looked intact. The house, the reputation, the appearance of stability that wealth and status are supposed to guarantee. But Mel described it as rot beneath polished wood, invisible until the structure can no longer support itself. By the time the damage becomes visible, repair is no longer an option. Collapse is. For Mel, this was the hardest truth to accept, that the warning signs were not hidden. They were simply reinterpreted again and again until they lost their force. And when clarity finally arrived, it did so too late to change anything that mattered. As days passed, Mel began to understand that what haunted him most was not anger, but responsibility. Not legal responsibility, and not moral certainty, but the quiet weight carried by those who remain. He questioned his own restraint, the moments when he sensed that concern was hardening into danger, but chose patience instead of confrontation. Loyalty had guided him for decades. Now it felt heavier, more complicated, stripped of the comfort it once provided. He did not claim that a single intervention would have changed everything. He was careful about that. What troubled him was the accumulation of moments when action felt possible but uncomfortable. Moments when speaking plainly risked damaging relationships that had been built over a lifetime. In families bound by history and affection, the fear of becoming the person who breaks the illusion of safety can be paralyzing. Mel recognized that fear now with painful clarity. This was why he chose to speak, not to influence an investigation and not to reshape public judgment. The outcome would unfold on its own. What mattered to him was how the story would live on after the noise faded. He did not want his friend remembered only through the final act of his life, reduced to a cautionary headline stripped of humanity. He wanted the years before it to matter. The intentions, the missteps, the love that complicated every choice. In telling this story, Mel was not asking for agreement or absolution. He was offering something far less comfortable, an insistence on honesty, on acknowledging that good intentions do not erase consequences, and that silence, even when motivated by care, can shape outcomes as surely as action. This, he believed, was the only truth worth preserving once everything else had been lost. What Mel wanted to leave behind was not a verdict, but a warning. He spoke less about blame and more about limits, the limits of love, of patience, of believing that care alone can neutralize danger. In families with means and influence, it is easy to assume that every problem can be managed, softened, delayed. That time, resources, and understanding will eventually bend the outcome in a safer direction. Mel no longer believed that. He had lived long enough to see how avoidance can masquerade as compassion, and how refusing to draw boundaries often postpones harm rather than preventing it. He spoke to parents who recognize pieces of this story in their own lives. Not just famous families, but any household where fear is quietly normalized and difficult choices are endlessly deferred. His message was not dramatic. It was restrained, almost weary. Love does not lose its value when it meets resistance, but it must change its shape. Without limits, it becomes something else entirely, something that protects the problem instead of the people. As the conversation ended, Mel did not ask to be understood. He asked to be heard, because silence had already cost too much. And if this story carried any purpose beyond grief, it was this: that recognizing danger is not the same as confronting it, and waiting for clarity does not mean clarity will arrive in time. This was the truth Mel Brooks chose to protect in the final chapter of his life. Not the image, not the legacy, but the lesson he wished someone had acted on sooner.